It started with a phone call. My brother had always been a mystery to me. A man of ambition, wealth, and secrets. He lived in Great Falls, Virginia, in a sprawling mansion, shielded by acres of private forest. His success had always been shrouded in questions. He rarely spoke about how he'd amassed his fortune, dismissing inquiries with a laugh and a vague response about business ventures. But this time, his call felt different. His voice was calm, deliberate, and almost unnervingly warm. "I'm hosting a private gathering this weekend," he said. "You should come. It'll be an experience." I wasn't one for his parties. They were always lavish, filled with strangers who seemed more like actors in some surreal play than real people. But something in his tone compelled me to accept. The curiosity that had lingered for years about his world now felt irresistible. Driving into Great Falls, I passed by gated communities and manicured lawns. But as I approached his estate, the scenery shifted. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The iron gates to his property opened slowly as I approached, revealing a long driveway lined with torches instead of the motion lights I'd remembered from my last visit. The mansion loomed ahead, its modern architecture stark against the surrounding wilderness. Yet as I stepped inside, it felt anything but modern. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, and the dim lighting cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. Guests milled about, dressed in dark formal attire, their laughter low and muted, as if they were afraid to draw attention to themselves. My brother greeted me at the foot of the grand staircase. He looked different, thinner, with a sharpness in his face that hadn't been there before. His smile was wide, but didn't reach his eyes. "You made it," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You're going to love this." He led me into a room I hadn't seen before, hidden behind what I assumed was a false wall. The space was circular, its walls lined with shelves, filled with books bound in cracked leather, and jars containing unidentifiable substances. In the center was a long table, covered with a black cloth. The air was suffused with an overwhelming metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The guests began to file in, their movements deliberate and ritualistic. They sat around the table, my brother gesturing for me to take a seat as well. I hesitated, but his gaze was unyielding. When everyone was seated, a man in a crimson robe entered the room. His face was obscured by a hood, and he carried a silver chalice that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light. The murmurs in the room ceased as he began to speak, in a language I couldn't place, his voice deep and resonant, each word feeling like it echoed inside my skull. As the ritual unfolded, I began to notice the details I'd missed before, the intricate carvings on the table, depicting scenes of violence. The jars on the shelves, now pulsing faintly with an otherworldly light. The chalice, now filled with a thick dark liquid that smelled of copper. My brother leaned in close and whispered, "This is power. Real power. You won't understand it yet, but you will." I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of that room, but I couldn't move. It was as though the air itself had turned to stone, pinning me in place. Then came the meal. Plates were brought out, covered in polished silver domes. When they were lifted, I felt my stomach turn. The dishes were elaborate, but grotesque. Meat that looked too human. My brother raised his glass, a dark smile on his lips. "To transcendence," he said. I didn't eat. I couldn't. But the others did, their faces calm, even reverent, as they consumed the unthinkable. I turned to my brother, horrified. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. He chuckled. "The cost of greatness," he said simply. I finally found the strength to stand, stumbling out of the room and into the cool night air. My head spun, my stomach heaving. I made it to my car and drove, not caring about the road ahead, just desperate to get away from that place. My brother hasn't called me since. I don't know what I witnessed that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in Great Falls again. The decision to head out for a picnic wasn't a casual one. My wife and I had planned this day carefully, considering her pregnancy. She was 6 months along, her belly rounding beautifully, and I couldn't help but marvel at how radiant she looked lately. The baby had brought so much excitement into our lives, and this picnic was meant to be a moment of peace, a reprieve from the endless doctor appointments and nursery preparations. We chose a spot we'd read about online, a quiet clearing near Hollow Glen Park, outside Afton, Virginia, tucked away in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The reviews all described it as serene, a hidden gem, far from the usual trails and crowds. Exactly what we were looking for. It was a beautiful spring day. The air was crisp, but not cold, and the sky was the kind of flawless blue that felt almost unreal. As we drove up the winding roads leading to the park, we passed rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. My wife was humming softly in the passenger seat, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her from the corner of my eye. When we arrived, the area was as idyllic as the pictures had promised. The clearing was framed by tall trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. Beyond them, the forest stretched on endlessly, a sea of green that seemed untouched by time. A small creek ran along the edge of the clearing, its soft babble the only sound breaking the stillness. We laid out the blanket near the creek, unpacking the basket filled with sandwiches, fruit, and her favorite cookies. My wife sat back against the trunk of a tree, closing her eyes as she let the sun warm her face. "This is perfect," she said softly, her voice filled with contentment. For the first hour, it truly was perfect. We ate, talked, and laughed, losing ourselves in the tranquility of the moment. She rested her head on my shoulder, her hand tracing lazy circles over her belly as we talked about baby names. We debated whether it would be a boy or a girl, though we'd chosen not to find out until the birth. But then, slowly, things began to change. At first it was so subtle I barely noticed. The birds that had been chirping earlier went silent, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to vanish. The creek, which had been lively and cheerful, now seemed quieter, its babble muted as though someone had turned down the volume on nature itself. I glanced at my wife, but she hadn't noticed yet. She was still leaning against the tree, her eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. I didn't want to alarm her, so I brushed it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease began to grow, like an invisible weight pressing down on the clearing. A sudden faint sound snapped me out of my thoughts. It was low and distant, almost like a groan, but deeper, an unnatural vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. I frowned and stood, scanning the tree line. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker than they should have been, and as I looked closer, I noticed the oddest thing. The breeze had completely stopped. The tall grass in the clearing stood motionless, the leaves on the trees utterly still. "Hey," I said softly, kneeling down to my wife. "Do you feel that?" She opened her eyes, her smile fading as she sat up straighter. "Feel what?" Before I could answer, there was another sound, louder this time. A low, rumbling noise that sent a shiver down my spine. My wife's hand went instinctively to her stomach, her eyes wide with alarm. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice lower than I intended. "Maybe it's just an animal." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The noise hadn't sounded like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deep, too resonant, as though it had come from something massive, something unnatural. And then I saw it, a dark shape at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the shadows of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline seemed to ripple, as though it weren't entirely solid. I froze, unable to look away, my breath caught in my throat. "Get up," I said to my wife, my voice shaking. "We need to go, now." She struggled to her feet, clutching my arm for support. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but we're not staying to find out." We began gathering our things as quickly as we could, but the air had grown heavier, the pressure in the clearing almost suffocating. My wife winced, her hand going to her stomach again. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice tight with pain. I dropped everything and grabbed her arm, guiding her toward the car. She stumbled, her face pale, sweat beading on her forehead. "It hurts," she gasped. "It hurts so much." We hadn't made it halfway to the car when the shadow moved. It darted across the clearing with impossible speed, its form growing larger, darker, more menacing. The air around us turned icy, and a piercing sound erupted, like the scream of metal being torn apart. My wife collapsed to her knees, crying out in agony. I crouched beside her, my heart racing. "We're almost there," I said, trying to sound calm even as terror gripped me. "Just a little farther." The shadow was nearly upon us now, a massive, amorphous thing that seemed to suck the light out of the world around it. My wife screamed, clutching her stomach as if trying to shield our baby from whatever this was. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shadow stopped. It hovered there for a moment, pulsating, before retreating into the forest as quickly as it had come. But the damage was done. My wife was unconscious by the time we reached the car, her face pale, her breathing shallow. I drove faster than I ever have in my life, ignoring the twisting roads and sharp turns as I raced toward the nearest hospital. When we arrived, they took her away immediately, leaving me alone in the sterile waiting room. I paced back and forth. The image of that shadow burned into my mind. What was it? Why had it come for us? The doctor came out hours later, his expression grim. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Your wife is stable, but the baby didn't make it." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But all I could do was sit there, numb and hollow. In the days that followed, my wife and I tried to move forward, but the grief hung over us like a storm cloud. She kept saying she felt like something had taken our baby, and deep down, I knew she was right. I went back to Hollow Glen Park once, desperate for answers. The clearing was exactly as we'd left it, calm, peaceful, untouched. But as I stood there, I felt it again. The heaviness in the air, the unnatural silence, the sense that I was being watched. I left and never went back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some losses can never be explained. Whatever we encountered that day took more than our child. It took our peace, our sense of safety, and it left behind a wound that will never fully heal.
The drive had started like any other. I was headed to a cabin in the mountains near Shenandoah National Park, looking forward to a weekend of solitude. The air was crisp and cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones but felt clean, invigorating. The sun was setting as I began the ascent up the narrow mountain road, the golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows that danced across my windshield. The road itself was desolate. No cars in either direction, no signs of life except for the occasional deer darting across the pavement. I had driven this route before, but tonight it felt different. The deeper I went, the darker the forest seemed to grow. The trees were unnaturally tall and tightly packed, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on the rhythmic hum of my tires against the asphalt. That's when I saw it, movement in the trees to my right. At first, I thought it was another deer, but the shape was all wrong. It was too tall, too upright. I slowed the car, peering into the thick underbrush, but whatever it was had disappeared. A few minutes later, the road began to climb sharply, winding in steep curves around the mountainside. The forest seemed to close in on me, the towering pines forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only the narrow stretch of road ahead. And then it appeared. It stepped out of the forest with an unnatural grace, its massive frame moving in complete silence. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as my headlights washed over it, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs, easily over 7 feet tall, its fur a mottled gray that seemed to blend into the shadows. Its shoulders were broad, its arms long and powerful, ending in hands with claws that glinted faintly in the light. I froze, my foot instinctively hitting the brake. The creature turned its head toward me, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's, but there was something in them that was disturbingly human, intelligence, and something else, malice. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I honked the horn, the sound echoing through the silent forest. The creature flinched, then let out a low, guttural growl that I felt more than heard. It began to move toward the car, its gait smooth and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed up the narrow road. The creature broke into a sprint, its massive frame hurtling toward me with terrifying speed. I whipped the car around, the tires skidding on the loose gravel at the edge of the road. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to go over the edge, but I managed to regain control, flooring the gas pedal as I sped down the mountain. The creature didn't stop. In the rearview mirror, I could see it running after me, its long strides eating up the distance between us. My heart was racing as I swerved around the tight curves, the car barely clinging to the road. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't slow down, not until I reached the base of the mountain and the forest began to thin. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it lurking in the shadows. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, mumbling something about needing water. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe me? But as I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I noticed a faded flyer pinned to the bulletin board by the door. "Missing hiker," it read, above a grainy photo of a young man. Beneath it was another flyer, and another. All of them described people who had vanished in the same area I had just driven through. None of them had ever been found. I didn't go back to the mountains after that. Whatever I had seen that night, it wasn't meant to be found, and I had no intention of crossing its path again.
The road to the Blue Ridge Mountains was long and winding, with dark, towering trees on both sides, their shadows creeping across the pavement as the sun dipped low. My wife and daughter sat quietly in the car, the air heavy with anticipation. We had planned this weekend getaway for months, eager to escape the monotony of city life. I had booked a hotel nestled deep in the heart of the Virginia wilderness, a place that promised serenity and charm. As we pulled up to the entrance, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The inn stood tall and weathered, its paint peeling in places, and its once grand facade now draped in ivy. There were no other cars in the gravel parking lot, save for an old rusted pickup truck. Inside, the lobby was eerily quiet, its air thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. A man in a suit that seemed just slightly out of fashion greeted us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said in a low, almost monotone voice, his gaze lingering on my daughter for a beat too long. The room we were assigned was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway, lined with dimly flickering sconces. My daughter held my hand tightly, her usual chatter replaced by an odd silence. As we entered, my wife gave me a puzzled look. The room was far from what I had expected. The wallpaper was faded, curling at the edges, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. Still, we tried to make the best of it. We settled in and decided to explore the inn before dinner. The dining hall, with its high ceilings and grand chandeliers, felt oddly out of time. The few other guests we saw looked equally out of place, dressed as if they'd stepped out of an old photograph, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't speak to us, only watching with expressions that were impossible to read. That night, I was woken by a sound. It wasn't loud, more like a faint creak, but in the oppressive silence of the inn, it felt deafening. My wife stirred beside me but didn't wake. I looked over at my daughter, who was asleep in the small bed by the window. Her breathing was steady, but there was something off. I squinted in the dark, trying to make out what it was, and then I saw it, a handprint. It was pressed against the inside of the window pane, fogged with condensation, as though someone had been standing there moments ago. My stomach tightened. We were on the 3rd floor. The next morning I brushed it off as a trick of the light. My wife seemed oblivious to the strangeness, but my daughter was unusually quiet. Over breakfast she told me she didn't want to stay another night. When I asked why, she said, "The man in the hallway scares me." My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What man?" I asked. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "The man with no eyes,"